Hello, everyone. My name is Tanner Nemeth, and today I'll be presenting the paper SoK Prudent Evaluation Practices for Fuzzing, published at IEEE Symposium on Security and Privacy in 2024. This paper is interesting because it doesn't introduce a new fuzzing technique at all. Instead, it focuses on something that is arguably just as important: how fuzzers are evaluated in research papers. Fuzzing has become one of the most successful automated vulnerability discovery techniques in software today. Many well-known tools such as AFL, AFL++, and HongFuzz have been used to discover thousands of real-world vulnerabilities in widely deployed software. Because of this success, a large amount of fuzzing research has appeared in recent years. Researchers constantly publish new fuzzers claiming improvements like finding bugs faster, reaching deeper code paths, or outperforming previous fuzzers. However, the authors of these papers raise an important question. How do we know these claims are actually correct? If fuzzers are evaluated poorly, then they may end up with papers that claim improvements that are due to experimental artifacts rather than real improvements. So, the goal of this paper was to find out how fuzzing evaluations are performed across the research community, identify common problems, and propose better evaluation practices. Now, why should we care? Fuzzing has proven to be extremely effective at finding real security bugs. Many vulnerabilities discovered by fuzzers have resulted in real world CVEs affecting major software projects like web browsers, compilers, and libraries. Because of this, researchers often build new fuzzers and then compare them against existing tools. But here's the problem. When a paper claims our fuzzer is better, that claim is depends heavily on how the evaluation was performed. Small changes in experimental setup can drastically change the results. For example, the seed inputs used to start the fuzzing, the programs chosen at test targets, the time budget given to each fuzzer, the number of trials, or the hardware environment. If these factors are not controlled carefully, a new fuzzer might appear better simply because of the experiment was designed in a favorable way. The authors argue that the problem is becoming increasingly serious as the fuzzing field grows. Their goal is to therefore answer the few questions of: how are fuzzing evaluations currently performed? Are current practices reliable? And what guidelines should research follow to make sure evaluations are more trustworthy? This leads directly into the core theme of the paper: prudent evaluation practices for fuzzing research. Now, before discussing actual evaluation practices, let's review exactly what fuzzing actually is. At a high level, fuzzing is automated test generation. A fuzzer repeatedly feeds inputs into a program in order to trigger crashes or other abnormal behavior that may indicate a bug. The typical fuzzing loop looks something like this: generate or mutate an input, run the target program with that input, monitor the program for crashes or sanitizer errors, repeat this process millions of times. The key idea is that by executing the program with massive numbers of different inputs, the fuzzer can eventually trigger unexpected behavior that reveals vulnerabilities. Modern fuzzers often run millions or even billions of executions, which would be impossible to do manually. Another important detail is that fuzzers frequently rely on tools like sanitizers, such as address sanitizer or undefined behavior sanitizer. These sanitizers detect issues like memory corruption, buffer out overflow, or use after free errors. So when the slide mentions watch for crashes or sanitizer bugs, it refers to these automated mechanics that detect unsafe program behavior. Fuzzing has been extremely effective because it can explore many possible program behaviors quickly, often uncovering bugs that traditional testing misses. One of the most important innovations in modern fuzzing is something called coverage guided fuzzing. Earlier, fuzzers generated random inputs without any feedback from the program. These are often called black box fuzzers. However, modern fuzzers like AFL and libfuzzer take a smarter approach. They monitor code coverage, meaning which parts of the program's code are executed during each run. Here's how feedback loop works. Here's how the feedback loop works. The fuzzer begins with a seed corpus, which is a set of initial inputs that the program can process. Then the fuzzer repeatedly mutates an input from the corpus, executes the program with the mutated input, measures code coverage, meaning which new parts of the program were reached. If the input reaches new code paths, the fuzzer keeps that input in the corpus. This creates a feedback loop where the fuzzer gradually explores deeper parts of the program. Over time, this process allows the fuzzer to discover rare execution paths that may contain bugs. This feedback-driven exploration is one of the reasons why coverage-guided fuzzers have become so successful in modern vulnerability discovery. However, this complexity also makes evaluating fuzzers more difficult, which leads into our next slide. What's hard about evaluating fuzzers? Evaluating fuzzers turns out to be surprisingly difficult. The main reason is that fuzzing is highly non-deterministic, meaning that the results can vary significantly between runs. Even small changes can affect the outcome. For example, fuzzers rely heavily on some randomness when generating inputs. Because of this, two runs of the exact same fuzzer on the same program can produce very different results. Other factors that can also influence outcomes include the initial seed inputs, machine load or CPU scheduling, memory layout differences, compiler optimizations, and the time budget given to the experiment. Because of this variability, a single run of a fuzzer is often not representative of its true performance. The authors of this paper emphasize that this randomness makes fuzzing experiments statistically noisy, meaning results must be interpreted carefully. If researchers run experiments only once or twice, they might accidentally report results that were simply due to luck. This is one of the core motivations behind this paper. The authors argue that fuzzing research needs more rigorous evaluation methods, including multiple trials, careful experimental design, and proper statistical analysis. In the rest of this presentation, we'll look at how the authors studied current fuzzing research and what problems they discovered. Before going any further, it's important to understand what kind of paper this is. This paper is labeled as SoK, which stands for Systemization of Knowledge. In security research, an SoK paper is different from a typical research paper. Instead of introducing a brand new technique or tool, a SoK paper tries to organize and critically analyze the current state of a research field. You can think of it as a kind of field level audit. The goal is to look across many existing papers and answer questions like what approaches are researchers using, what assumptions are common, what mistakes or weaknesses appear repeatedly, and what are the best practices the community should adopt going forward. In this particular case, the authors are not introducing a new fuzzer. Instead, they are investigating how fuzzers are evaluated in public research. Their goal is to determine whether the evaluation practices used in fuzzer papers are scientifically rigorous and reproducible, and if not, how can the field improve? So the contribution of the paper is mainly methodical guidance for fuzzing research community. To analyze the state of the fuzzing evaluation, the authors performed two main studies. First, they conducted a large survey of fuzzing research papers. Specifically, they analyzed 150 fuzzing papers published between 2018 and 2023. Their goal was to understand how fuzzers are typically evaluated in research literature. They examined things like which benchmarks were used, which metrics were reported, how many experimental trials were performed, and how many baselines were chosen. This allowed them to identify patterns and common weaknesses in evaluation practices. But the authors did not stop there. They also conducted 8 reproduction case studies. In these experiments, they attempted to reproduce the results of previously published fuzzing papers. Reproducibility is a major issue in scientific research. If a result cannot be reproduced by independent researchers, then it is reliably becomes questionable. During these reproduction attempts, the authors often encountered problems such as missing scripts, incomplete configuration details, undocumented assumptions, and environmental mismatches. These reproduction challenges helped reveal practical obstacles that make fuzzing research difficult to replicate. So, by combining a large literature survey with hands on reproduction experiments, the authors were able to build a comprehensive picture of how fuzzing evaluation is currently performed. One of the key contributions of the paper is a set of guidelines for responsible fuzzing evaluation. The authors propose a checklist of 5 principles that researchers should follow when evaluating fuzzers. Their first principle is fair baselines. When comparing a new fuzzer to existing tools, those baseline tools must be configured correctly and given comparable resources. Otherwise, the comparison may not be meaningful. The second principle is good target selection. The programs used in experiments should represent a diverse and realistic set of targets. If researchers choose only certain programs that favor their technique, the results may be biased. The third principle is clear experimental setup. All configuration details, parameters, and scripts should be documented so that other researchers can reproduce the experiments. The fourth principle is meaningful evaluation metrics. Researchers must choose metrics that actually reflect what they claim their tool improves. For example, if a paper claims to find more bugs, then the evaluation should measure actual confirmed bugs, not just proxy indicators. Finally, the fifth principle is proper statistical analysis. Because fuzzing experiments are noisy, researchers should run multiple trials and reports measures such as variance or confidence intervals. Together, these principles form the foundation for prudent fuzzing evaluation practices. The first evaluation principle discussed in the paper is fair baseline comparisons. When a researcher introduces a new fuzzer, they typically compare it against existing fuzzers such as AFL, AFL++, LibFuzzer, or HongFuzz. However, these comparisons are only meaningful if the baseline tools are configured correctly and fairly. For example, both fuzzers should be given the same time budget, CPU cores, memory resources, and experimental conditions. If one tool is given more computational resources, it may appear stronger even if the algorithm itself is not better. Another issue is the authors mention is the use of strawman baselines. A strawman baseline is a comparison tool that is intentionally configured poorly or chosen because it performs weakly. For example, a paper might compare against an outdated fuzzer rather than a strong modern baseline. In that case, the new tool might appear superior simply because the comparison was unfair. The authors argue that researchers must compare against a strong and properly configured baselines in order to make credible claims about improvements. Another major factor that can influence fuzzing results is the choice of target programs. In fuzzing experiments, the target program is the software being tested for vulnerabilities. Researchers often use 2 types of targets. The first type is benchmarks. Benchmarks are typically small, simplified programs designed specifically for testing fuzzers. They are easier to run and analyze, which makes experiments more convenient. However, benchmarks may not reflect the complexity of real world software. The second type is real world software targets, such as browsers, compression libraries, or network parsers. These programs are much larger and more complex and therefore provide a more realistic more realistic test of a fuzzer's capabilities. The authors point out that the target selection can dramatically influence results. A fuzzer that performs well on one set of programs may perform poorly on another. Because of this, researchers must avoid cherry picking targets that make their tools look good. Instead, they should evaluate fuzzers on diverse and representative program sets to ensure that results generalize to real world software. Now we move on to another major issue the paper discusses: evaluation metrics. When researchers claim their fuzzer is better than anyone, they need to measure something to support that claim. However, not all metrics are equally reliable. The authors argue that the best possible metric is confirmed bugs. If a fuzzer actually finds more real vulnerabilities in a program, that is the strongest possible evidence that is effective. However, confirmed bugs can be difficult to measure because they require manual analysis and verification. Because of that, many papers instead rely on proxy metrics. Examples include numbers of crashes, number of unique crashes, code coverage. These metrics are easier to measure automatically, but they can be misleading. For example, a crash does not necessarily mean a real vulnerability. Multiple crashes may actually be caused by the same underlying bug. Similarly, higher code coverage does not always translate to finding more bugs. The authors emphasize that the chosen metric should match the claim being made. If a paper claims to discover more vulnerabilities, then the evaluation should demonstrate actual bug discovery, not just not just coverage improvements. So the key takeaway is that researchers must be careful when choosing evaluation metrics. Another major challenge in fuzzing evaluation is randomness. Fuzzers rely heavily on random input mutations, which means that the results can vary significantly between runs. Because of this, the authors argue that multiple experimental trials are absolutely necessary. Running a fuzzer only once is not sufficient enough to understand its true performance. Instead, researchers should run the experiment multiple times and then analyze the distribution of results. For example, two runs of the same fuzzer might find different numbers of crashes simply due to the random chance. If a paper reports only the best run, that can create a misleading impression. The authors recommend that researchers report statistical uncertainty, such as variance, standard deviation, or confidence intervals. These statistics help readers understand how consistent the results actually are. Without this information, it is difficult to know whether an improvement is truly meaningful or just random variation. So, the main message of this slide is that statistical rigor is essential when evaluating fuzzers. After surveying 150 papers, the authors discovered several common evaluation problems. One major issue was too few trials. Many papers ran fuzzing experiments only once or a small number of times, which is problematic given the randomness we just discussed. Another issue was weak statistical analysis. Even when multiple trials were performed, some papers did not report variance or confidence intervals. The third problem was incomplete experimental setup descriptions. Sometimes papers did not fully describe their configuration, which makes it difficult for other researchers to reproduce the results. And finally, the authors observed heavily reliance on proxy metrics, such as code coverage or crash counts, rather than confirmed vulnerabilities. Individually, these issues might seem minor, but when they occur together, they can significantly reduce the reliability of experimental conclusions. The authors therefore argue that the fuzzing research community needs to adopt more consistent evaluation standards. Another interesting topic the paper discusses is the use of CVE counts as a metric. A CVE, or Common Vulnerabilities and Exposures Identifier, is used to catalog publicly disclosed software vulnerabilities. At first glance, counting CVEs discovered by a fuzzer seems like a good way to measure impact. If a tool discovers many CVEs, it might appear very successful. However, the authors explain that CVE counts can actually be misleading. First, not all vulnerabilities are equally severe. Some CVEs represent critical security flaws, while others may involve minor issues with limited real-world impact. Second, CVE assignment is influenced by reporting processes and incentives. Different organizations may assign CVEs differently, and not every bug discovered by a fuzzer ends up receiving a CVE identifier. Finally, some vulnerabilities may be duplicate reports of the same underlying issue. Because of these factors, the number of CVE discoveries discovered by a fuzzer does not necessarily reflect its true security impact. The authors therefore caution researchers against relying too heavily on CVE counts as an evaluation metric. The authors also conducted 8 reproduction case studies where they attempted to replicate experiments from previous fuzzing papers. These reproduction attempts revealed severe common failure points. One major problem was missing artifacts, such as scripts or configuration files required to run the experiment. Without these artifacts, reproducing results becomes extremely difficult. Another issue was environment mismatches. Fuzzing experiments often depend on specific compiler versions, operating systems, or runtime environments. If those environments are not documented carefully, reproducing the results can fail. The authors also observed setup differences, where small configuration changes significantly affected outcomes. Finally, comparing the results can be difficult if papers do not clearly explain how metrics were computed. These reproduction challenges highlight the importance of transparent experimental practices. If research results cannot be reproduced, it becomes difficult for the community to validate or build upon them. To conclude, this paper provides a comprehensive look at fuzzing evaluations, how fuzzing evaluations are currently conducted in research. By analyzing 150 papers and performing reproduction studies, the authors identified several weaknesses in common evaluation practices. In response, they propose a set guidelines for prudent fuzzing evaluation, including using fair baselines, selecting diverse targets, clearly documenting experimental setups, choosing meaningful metrics, and applying proper statistical analysis. The overall goal is to improve the scientific rigor and reproducibility of fuzzing research. As fuzzing continues to play an important role in discovering software vulnerabilities, ensuring that evaluation practices are reliable becomes increasingly important. Thank you.